and Paris. There was an idea in the Soviet intelligentsia, no, the Russian intelligentsia, that were around the art schools and the performance spaces of Moscow, that Paris was the capital, cultural capital of the world. That's where the good art was, that's where the good performances were, that's where the interesting movements were coming from, that were progressive, that were modern, that were exactly what they could be doing in the Soviet Union, which was backward, field of non-industrialized properly, unmodern, undeveloped, underdeveloped, peasant-based, recently freed serf-based, and so on. And the thing that comes out in all their accounts is the sense of the cityness of Paris. And some of them went to Paris, some of them studied in Paris, and that's why we start our story from Paris, in terms of the readings. Now, not only was Paris an imperial center, a cultural center, and a very dynamic city that was contrasting itself to London, which was the financial center of empire during that time. And there was a lot going on in Paris, and that's where Bourdieu is useful in order to understand the dynamics, the social dynamics. So, if we take the Bourdieu readings, in Rules of Art, he wants to understand Flaubert, this book, the novelist. And he uses Flaubert in order to make the sociological points that he wants to make, to develop a science of the aesthetic sphere. So, his task is a political one too. He forces us back to those times in France, and by implication in Europe, where a struggle for independence, where the virtues of revolt and resistance led artists and writers to assert themselves clearly in the face of repression, and argue and fight for intellectual freedom. The right for pure art to express itself, the artist to express him or herself in whatever way she deemed fit, because art was a special and autonomous field, and parallel with science, an intellectual and philosophical life about the autonomy of ideas and knowledge from forces. Now, so he is studying the creation of autonomous fields of art and how they start defining their own legitimacy. Don't have non-experts in art talk about art, something profound, something deep that has to be understood. And the field, he argues, starts imposing during those days its own laws on how the field should operate. So, this is whatever is prefigured, and that's an interesting thing for sociologists. What is dominant, aesthetically dominant in Paris, is not what is exported as dominant French culture in the colonies. It's two different things. It's very important to understand. But what is exported in the colonies and also in other societies like Russia, like China, like South Africa, is the aura of Paris as the metropole of culture. There's a lot of that. Now, unfortunately, Edward Said didn't handle the Parisian writers of the time. He deals with Kipling and others. He does more the Anglo bit. But if you take what they're writing, in terms of their international, the imagination, it's very Orientalist. The other is conceived in the writings, very Orientalist. It's not demeaning in all of them, but it's most certainly false. So that's important. And then when you look at that, what he does there, Bourdieu, is that he shows how the artists distinguish themselves in relation to money and the market on the one hand, which was punctuated by publishers, the importance of the book. Think of the time before the movies. Think of the time before the radio, before TV, before everything. The book and the press was absolutely crucial. So publishing. And so on the one hand, there is the market. So successful artists, no, they are about money. Art, pure art, is for art, not for money. And at the same time, about lifestyles, connections. And there you read in France about salons, where artists meet, and where artists meet with power, and where privilege is bestowed onto artists. And these competitions between the fields there create this world of specific powers, of exclusion and inclusion. And what he calls a proletaroid intelligentsia is people who have to live with the poor, but have to take the airs of the cultural critic and take pennies from newspapers and write about art and say this school is important, that school is important, and create this atmosphere around art and artists that reinforces the autonomy of the fields, and also the bohemian lifestyles that go with them. So if you page 56 of the Rules of Art, he says it better ways than I can say it. It's an ambiguous reality. Bohemia inspires ambivalent feelings even among its most passionate defenders. In the first place, this is because it defies classification. It's near to the people, with whom it often shares misery. It is separated from them by the art of living that defines it socially, and which, even if ostentatiously opposed to the conventions and proprieties of the bourgeoisie, is situated nearer to the aristocracy, in a sense, in terms of their heirs. And in the matter of relations between the sexes and within the sexes, where it experiments on a large scale, as bohemian lifestyles do, all forms of transgression being talked about and permitted, and free love, venal love, pure love, eroticism, all these things are active in the 19th century there, which it institutes as models in its writings. So all of a sudden, the artist becomes this bohemian model that is being passed around. That's why everybody has to wear a beret. Okay. Well, this is no less true of its most destitute members, who strong in their cultural capital and their authority born of being tastemakers, succeed in providing themselves at least the cost with audacities of dress, culinary fantasies, mercenary loves, and refined leisure, for all of which the bourgeois pay dearly. So in other words, there's also lifestyles. It's a cultural formation. Being an artist becomes a life form there in Paris, and it's being exported as the way to be. And they despise increasingly the public, and they despise the bourgeois. So the court in between. But like Flaubert, the bourgeois is everybody who's involved in the mundane, from the clerk to the bank teller to the rich people to the people who are worried with money and this bourgeois world. And at the same time, the public, the vulgar, the this, the that, or the roles of distinctions. So for Bourdieu, it's this Paris that excites him, in order to show how it's got its own dynamics in the various fields that operate. Benjamin's Paris is slightly different. It's more revolutionary. He looks at the revolutions of 1848 and 1872. There he looks at how the city itself becomes the inspiration for art. There's the arcades, there is street life. There is the flaneur, as he calls it, the bohemian walking the streets, and the new moralities that come with that. But there is the aura of the cityness of Paris that's very important, but also what he begins to pick up in little marginal notes in arcades, and you have to read it by Monday, is the refuge space, Paris, for refugees, for blacks, free slaves, Jews, political refugees from Germany, And so Marx is there in 1844, writing the Paris philosophical manuscripts. So it's the city as a cosmopolitan, multicultural space that's beginning to be noticed there. So they're different, Benjamin's and Bourdieu's takes on Paris. But what we can get for them is that this idea of aesthetic constellations very clearly from that work, how they imagine other spaces and other places, and how they relate to social movements in interesting ways. Now, in looking at Flaubert and Baudelaire, it's very interesting. You read Baudelaire, and then we get the poems, and his sense of the other is a little bit exotic. Look at this love poem. In a sense, although he's venal, although he's into the dirt in the streets, irritates the bourgeois, just about his morality, the way he carries out his life, the way he writes, the way he attacks religion, so he is there in your face, Baudelaire. He's the first modern poet, as people say. But even when she walks, she seems to dance. The garments writhe and glisten like long snakes, obedient to the rhythms of the wands, by which a fakir wakens them to grace. Precious minerals from the polished eyes, in her strange symbolic nature, where angel and sphinx unite, where diamond, gold, and steel dissolve into the light, we see the puppet's icy majesty. And this is a poem to his lover. Exotic, isn't it? Fakirs, snakes, and so on. Well, she was a black actress, his black partner, and she was dealing with the plays, not of the high haute bourgeoisie, but with the music halls and so on, where black singers and actors and actresses could be. So, ambiguous, so you read his views of, let's say, Mauritius, the colonies, and so on, you say, Orientalism. But he's living a different kind of life. So Baudelaire, if you look at his poetry, is precisely a rejection of the past, an intense modernity, and an intense celebration of the cityness of Paris at that stage in time. If you move to Rimbaud, you start seeing a total rejection of the West. He belongs to the intense little networks defining themselves against other poets. They're the special, Mallarmé and he and others are, don't want to mix with these and those other poets. But he was on the barricades of the Paris Commune. And if you look at his poetry, Season in Hell or Drunken Boat, it is a farewell to Europe, if you look at it. And indeed, he packs up his bags and off he goes to Ethiopia thereafter, and where he sells guns. So, but again, you get an intense sense of poetry that is remarkably new. And around that, after Rimbaud, you start seeing the crystallization of certain movements. The Cubists, the Futurists, the Surrealists, movements that are seeing themselves as ultra-modern. And that is what the Russians are looking at. That's what they're looking at, these movements. So the Paris of Flaubert, Baudelaire, Rimbaud does become the aesthetic capital of the world because of its proliferation of this kind of avant-garde activity. Its multiple and competing schools, its so-called metropolitan nature, layer and layer of fascination with its milieu and agendas. And they play off against each other, these aesthetic groups with missionary zeal. They hate each other. And so if the establishment of autonomous aesthetic spheres was the first phase of the expressive revolution, The second was in the development of seemingly exclusive schools with the banner of modernity hoisted high. That was the issue. So, each movement creates its communities of practice and its internationals. And each one is being celebrated internationally. And that is why Mayakovsky leans over the fence and takes futurism as his banner and brings it to Russia, and then tries to define a futurism that is sensitive to the revolution, through his poetry, through his plays, and so on. And so, what you see, therefore, is in the Soviet Union is a proliferation of schools that are responding to these Parisian and then later European movements. Constructivism, futurism, and then as it gets political, the prolet cult people as opposed to the League of Revolutionary Writers, or these or those, all these groups are forming and competing against each other, and they hate each other to the sky. You look at the venom between these competing schools. It's incredible. But one thing that creeps in is it's a kind of a celebration of science and technology, of progress and rational abstraction. And it was the revolutionary challenge of Tsarist Russia allowed this progressivism to be celebrated to start with. And it's the book Makel Stites, Revolutionary Utopias, is a fantastic description of these schools and how they proliferated in the Soviet, in Russia and then the Soviet Union. And so, if you, through it, working people, craftsmen and artists, professionals and intellectuals, learn that Soviets might provide an answer to authoritarianism and generate a new society of fundamental freedoms. Fine artists like Malevich, in his defining piece, it's basically, he argues from cubism to futurism to suprematism. Suprematism is his own philosophy, with his own people. In 1915. So he yearned for a society that would allow art to move beyond the interrelation of form and color, and to move beyond the aesthetic basis of beauty and composition, to arrive at a scientistic moment where art occurred on a basis of weight, speed, duration, and movement. That was his manifesto. The obsession with geometry and mathematical form was to reach new heights with the constructivists. Lisitsky, if you look at as a Russian artist, and he became part of the Stalin regime of art production. He also writes manifestos. If you don't want to be controlled by nature, study Cubism. So Cubism becomes the most important body. So energies in the post-revolutionary period, Malevich, Rodchenko, Lisitsky, Mayakovsky, all are people who are inspired by this idea. No wonder they also celebrated Taylor, the design of assembly line production in America, and Fordism, and production, and machines. And there was a league of poets who wrote praise poems to machines. What's his name? I prescribed one of the articles there, where he also became, his role in revolutionary Russia was to go around factories and praise machines and get people to work harder for the revolution and so on. So there is this scientific trend running through all this. And of course, there are other orthodoxies. There are the folklorists, there are the realists versus these people. And then there is ideas of social realism and socialist realism that begin to happen. Well, these people are a bunch of idiots. The real stuff has to reflect real Soviet reality, therefore it has to be a realism, but a socialist realism, not like realism in the West. So, socialist realism here, futurism there, this here, from a cult there, everybody's competing over scarce resources in the post-Soviet Russia, and everybody gets in each other's ways, and Mayakovsky is a victim, but also a perpetrator in a lot of this fighting that is happening. So, So between 1905, when the revolutionary movement started in Russia, to 1928, I would argue, there's a great experimental iconoclastic public art developed in the Soviet Union and spread to the country's aesthetic avant-gardes, begins to find a popular audience. And it is expressive, it idolizes science, the modern, and so on, as we said. And those are its limits, and those are its possibilities. So it's only in that context that we can really then go back and understand Mayakovsky and his poetry. Constructivists were fantastic abstracted scientists of the aesthetic, but they were scorned. Meyerhold, who redefined the theater, was part of those movements. He was celebrated and then scorned. Eisenstein was the filmmaker of note, starting modern movie. He was celebrated and scorned, and so on. So this rational productivism, this idea that you can make art that's relevant to the people, that its use value becomes very important, that everyday life has to be infused by, like Bauhaus and other places in Europe at the time, with aesthetic forms that, that things are useful and aesthetically beautiful. So in other words, without a deeper understanding of the conjuncture of that historical movement and so on how these people relate to it, all we can have is a series of poets, and Mayakovsky being an innovator in form, if you just study Russian poetry. He did some funny things with lines, and is therefore a genius because the way he constructed his poetry, which I don't doubt for any minute. So, but his appetite for transformation and change was gargantuan. As he says, stalking the world, handsome, 22-year-old, then 30-year-old. There's lots of self-praise in his poems. At the might of my voice, to accept the revolution, he says to an interviewer from the West, for me, this question never arises. It is my revolution. So that's whether bitter at the end, disappointed, reflecting how out of his own volition he was crushed underfoot in the poem, the throat of my very own songs, and how process and conditions make sure that, quote, the love boat of life has crashed on Philistine reefs in one of his poems, and such reefs were totally castigated. The new civil service, the new correct institutions, and whether in field and so on, he was critical of them. So it wasn't difficult to understand that that's from 1928, when socialist realism becomes the ideology, dominant artistic ideology of the Soviet Union, he would be in trouble. And he was, because then you have the gatekeepers, like in all societies, who write about art and so on, saying bad art, counter-revolutionary elements in the art, religious things are creeping in, personalism, and this and that. So once people start going for people, it becomes, we've seen it through the Brett painting. Once people start shouting, everybody has to shout louder in political formations. And, it escalates. So Mayakovsky was nothing. So in this context, I want you to look at Cloud in Trousers, but also his other poem, Pro Eto, or About This. In the end, just in that poem, About This, under the pressure of 1,000,000 volts, my lips jab into the receiver's molten pitch, bursting the cable. So again, there's the mechanical stuff, his voice just bursting through the wires. He is loudhailer par excellence. And then he concludes in the utopian wish, believing in the future chemical engineers of the Soviet Union, that they could resurrect him. That they could resurrect him, and you read this moving last stanzas of that poem, resurrect him out of this time, which is out of joint. with the real desires of a socialist poet. And he mourns the moment that that a poet of strife, as he calls himself, is being like this. And then he basically says, oh, please, chemical engineer of the future, resurrect her too, the subject of his love. And perhaps you could meet in the zoo in better times. Because she did love animals, by the way, so it would be a nice place to meet. And then forsake the fireside chair, so that love shall flood the universe, so as not to be by sorrow aged made, begging in the name of some Christ's birth, so that at the very first cry of comrade shall spin into one this very earth, so as to live not victims in some home holes curled, so that henceforth all kindred to each other, our Father at least will be our world, the earth at the very least our mother. So that's his, in a sense, it's a love poem, but it's again his manifesto of his disappointment with what is going on. So, in a sense, the one response of a major society was to try and identify what is progressive in the West, in Paris and London, and to celebrate it. And what was seen to be progressive were precisely these futurist, surrealist, cubist forms of art. And they were translated into usable forms of art in that big experiment, and created some of the most dominant languages of the optic and of performance that we inherited as creative people. There is nothing from fashion that is not related to suprematism or constructivism and those geometrical models that they developed. There's nothing from industrial design that doesn't have echoes of that movement and the Bauhaus movement and other movements, in terms of the usefulness of art. There's nothing in the theater that can not be in debate with Meyerhold's theater. There's nothing in the film without Eisenstein, a debate with Eisenstein. There is nothing here in poetry without this and so on, but also the reactions they generated. And there are profound pieces of poetry that are a reaction to all this, and a reaction to socialist realism, and a reaction to the Stalinist period that are still with us. So that was one moment. I do believe in looking at taking Mayakovsky, for instance, as a case study, or taking Meyerhold, or taking Eisenstein, or taking anyone, or taking the socialist realists, or Gorky, or anyone, we can demonstrate the importance of understanding the relationality of these concepts. Rodchenko never went to Paris when he started, but he lived in an imagined Paris because of the aesthetic constellation he thought he belonged to, because his buddies had been to Paris. But they were all about the local stuff that's happening in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. They were very urban boys. So, so there is this idea of a movement that is international, and that we are part of this movement that makes you act in specific ways. And there is your sense of what you don't like. If you really, really, really believe in certain tactile things about your art, there's certain things you exclude. So your acuities are honed in terms of certain areas of, let's say, of reception. There's certain things that irritate you, certain things you can't listen to, and so on. And they didn't like each other a lot of the time, in each other's work. And it all relates to this radical impulse of believing that your art, your craft, could potentially not only be shaping the morality of a movement, but that it would be of essence to everything. So that's why Mayakovsky is loud. He's loud, he is expansive, he believes that whatever he writes I'm sure he had an audience in his head